Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is not only a great day, it's one of the best days I get to do. I am doing a podcast today. My name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. We've got the Energy Newsbeat podcast. I have Johnathan Grammer here today. He is a CEO of U.S. Carbon Capture. A little bit of non-disclosure here. I've had Johnathan on the podcast before, and the podcast went nuts. I have to say, I got reached out and everybody was like, that podcast was pretty good, but that cougar over his shoulder was outstandingly way cool. So Johnathan, thank you for stopping by the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back, Stu.
I'll tell you, we're going to go into that cougar a little bit because I love that story. But we're not really here to talk about the cougar. We will kind of work him into the story here. A side note, I got scared out of my boots last night. I had a Mountain Lion screaming out here, and they scream. I mean, it's worse than my ex-wife. Oh, it'll scare you. So anyway, Johnathan, as the CEO of U.S. Carbon Capture, what do you really do? And what is U.S. Carbon Capture?
Well, I first became introduced to not only the technical possibility, but also the growing need for the capture of industrial carbon dioxide about 10 years ago. And we had, I don't think I went into this in the last podcast. If I did, I'll be very, very brief. Is we were contacted by not only an oil and gas client, but also a utility client that was looking to reduce its CO2 emissions from a power plant. Oil and gas client was looking for industrial CO2 to implement enhanced oil recovery in the Texas Panhandle.
Yep.
And at that time, I had Grammer Land and Exploration Corporation, which is a company that I still sit at the helm of. And we used our expertise and our knowledge and our relationships with geologists to sort of put together projects that were suitable for both of those entities. And neither one of them developed at that time. But given the changes in not only the climate change initiative, but also statutory guidelines that have been brought to bear, we decided it was time to sort of dust off a lot of that knowledge base. And so we formed U.S. Carbon Capture. I think we're now in our second or third year, and a 5-man consulting team helping industrial emitters reduce their carbon footprint, primarily targeting the fossil fuel industry. Targeting is a bad word, servicing the fossil fuel industry.
Oh, how cool. I'll tell you, carbon capture is such a big market right now, Johnathan, because, the ESG and oil and gas has gotten a bad name, whether right or wrong, they've had a bad name. And Oxy has really stepped up and stepped into that area. But what are you as U.S. Carbon Capture, what are you looking at as a market go-to in your market for that company?
Well, that has what I'll call is kind of a bifurcated approach. And to sort of back up when you were talking about the villainization of oil and gas, what really motivated our team was not so much really advocates or enthusiasts for climate change, but really to give defense to the fossil fuel industry that seemed to be getting villainized quite a bit in the discussion. And a lot of these, certainly all the technical expertise required for carbon capture is going to be coming from the petroleum industry, and we need to find ways to help sustain it. And if carbon reduction is going to be an initiative, we really got involved to help coal, oil, and natural gas continue to be a viable energy source. Once you have successfully captured CO2, and I think the answer to your question that you're looking for is, what is the market for the product that you have? It's both a pollutant and it's also a commodity. You can store it underground in a Class 6 storage well, or you can sell it actually to an oil and gas operator that's got a secondary water flood that's maturing out as a tertiary injectant. And it's a topic of conversation that we go through almost weekly. Which one of those markets are we going to try to pursue? We're also finding that a great many other people have the same discussion, because it is in fact an emerging market, one that's really just been throttled since September when the IRA was passed.
Right.
And so I hate to give you the answer. We really don't know at this point, but we're pursuing both. And
Nice.
I think both of them will probably be viable candidates for a market. So
That is absolutely fantastic. And as we sit there and, some of the things that are going on with the villainization of oil and gas, I have to hand it to the CEOs in the last year, standing up to Congress, and they're getting they're getting their face bashed in, saying, will you increase production and cut money back to your investors? And they're like, we've made commitments to our investors, and no, we're going to increase production, but we're also going to keep giving back to our investors. That's driving the government nuts.
right.
So, this kind of defense mechanism, by you giving that, to them, makes a big difference. And I think carbon capture, Johnathan, is going to be something that is viable and sustainable, because I think there's a chink in the armor with BP last week saying that they can't get into the profitability anymore of renewables.
Right.
I think there's huge profitability potential for carbon capture and still get into that ESG market.
I agree. And I think what we're experiencing, and probably will for the next year or two, is finding out where the pendulum is going to settle. How much of a renewable component do you want to have in your portfolio and in your energy infrastructure that's appropriate for your objective, but also is economic? And to the same extent, fossil fuels, to the same extent, carbon dioxide emissions. None of them are going to be an absolute. They seem to be throttled with a great deal of momentum at periodic moments. And then we have to let that momentum dissipate back down to find out how much of renewables, how much solar and wind do we need and do we want, and that's economic. We can't have an ESG motivated pendulum shift that's completely anti-fossil fuels.
Right.
Letting those pendulums kind of swing back and let the market really decide how much is going to be sustainable. And it's only going to be sustainable if it makes money. I mean, that's just a rule.
You had mentioned the IRA and the Inflation Reduction Act. The amount of money that's printed to do windmills and do solar and everything else, it's just amazing to see that. But you and I had been talking even a little bit last week, and we're talking about the changes in the entire industry. We were talking about some of the fun things there. What are you seeing coming around in the industry, Johnathan?
You're talking about in the renewable space?
Yeah, whatever you and I were talking about last week. I mean, it was
when we were on the phone. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's a good point. And we had talked about one of the things that I try to really focus on bringing is not necessarily opinions, but observations. I get, it's very difficult to formulate one's position if you're following only those things that you see on the internet, and usually my observations and all of our observations sometimes are very different. And I've seen a lot of stories about renewable projects that are not getting built, renewable projects that are not getting funded. I've seen the same thing about oil and gas development as well. I will tell you, our oil and gas component of one of our other companies, as we talked about before, Grammar Land and Exploration Corp, has been consumed with oil and gas work, interpreting mineral estates and working interest estates holdings underneath solar farm developments in the Permian Basin region. And a lot of large scale solar projects are moving into the reaches of West Texas and eastern New Mexico. In areas that are currently under existing production and are also slated for future production. And the arrangements, the surface use arrangements that have to be negotiated between not only the mineral owners who have a stake in the surface estate, but also the lessees that have operator and lease rights associated with it, is what we're working on, is identifying who the operators are, who the mineral owners are, so that solar companies and oil and gas operators and rights holders can work out appropriate use of the surface.
That's got to be complex, Johnathan.
Extremely complex for a variety of reasons, not necessarily because mineral estates and working interest estates can be very complicated, but also once you've identified the different rights that are colliding or unifying in a particular piece of property, you're also bringing together two industries that are politically adverse to each other and in large part seem to be in conflict with each other.
Right.
And so the real difficult and complicated component is trying to find out where the common ground is between two people and two industries that are approaching a scenario already, neither one of them really wanting each other to be in this space. And what we're finding out is is the stranded energy synergy, I guess, is solar may be something that the fossil fuel industry is adverse to, but in the deep regions of West Texas and New Mexico, they have a transmission problem getting electrical power out there. And so if we can carve out a certain megawattage for their use to develop and to continue to run their oil and gas hardware, that seems to be a catalyst to get some of these discussions going.
Holy smokes. I'm sitting here thinking of Chris Wright over there at Liberty Frac, one of the best CEOs on the planet. I've always had a saying, you get a good CEO in there and you get good numbers, good CEOs. And Chris Wright, I've had the fortune of getting to chat with him. He's got the electric fleet in there, and he's got, he's taken the ESG to heart, but he looks at it from a humanistic, how can low cost energy elevate humanity out of poverty? Johnathan, you just nailed on something that it's been troublesome in that whole area out there, and that is the transmission. But think about it, a frac fleet that's electric, all electric frac fleet takes power. So how can you get to run diesel generators out there to run a electric frac fleet? This is perfect. I mean, wow. That is combining. That's a good resource. You brought up the great point, because that equipment is not, it needs substantial power. I mean, and then by the time you build an energy storage facility out there, that is extremely expensive. And guess who pays that one? The consumers.
Right. And we've talked about this before. We need to frame up these conversations appropriately before we start them. I don't mean necessarily you and I, but the energy conversation. And unfortunately, I think framing up a conversation correctly to make progress, something we seem to be struggling with in society right now. I think we like to talk a lot out of emotion, and we like to talk a lot out of our political lobby. Right. But before you begin a conversation, it's deciding, okay, what is the actual landscape? And you said something just a moment ago that made me think about this, and that is, it requires a tremendous amount of power to run a frac fleet. Right. It's requiring a tremendous amount of power to do just about everything that we're doing from this point forward, certainly in the state of Texas. And I always want to remind people that are listening that I certainly don't, and I don't think anybody needs to be leveraging for one particular energy source over another. I think that's a really unfortunate component of the conversation, is where do they all meet together? Everybody's got an economic component to their energy source that's not good. Right. It's got a tax component that incentivizes. It's got a risk component. It's really finding where the middle ground exists and all of these things appropriately meet together. And this is what we're having to do, where we actually have joint clients. We represent oil and gas operators, and we also have people that we're doing for solar, trying to find out where that balance is going to exist, rather than trying to push each other literally off the landscape. I'm going to sidetrack for half a second, because this is such a fantastic conversation, Johnathan. Deborah Wall, and she is the CEO of Green Lily.
and Green Lily is a ESG power company. They can take waste, they can take anything, and they are a European company that has also come into the US, and the US company, they're working with cities, they're working with everything else, and all of their waste to fossil fuel is ESG. I mean, they can make ethanol, they can make diesel, they can make anything using advanced technology, but it's also it's not demonizing the fossil fuels, because it's a way to make it, right now, biodiesel and ethanol are more expensive to make because it takes more to cook it. But using
Right.
their technology, it just is a waste. I think we ought to ban ethanol, if you want my honest opinion, because it's such a horrible product on engines.
Yeah.
Takes more energy and everything else. And Deborah is just like your podcast, her podcast went nuts as well too. People want to hear that story of ESG, of invest in energy, low cost energy without subsidies. Johnathan, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. If you can't make money to deliver low cost, the lowest cost kilowatt per hour to the consumers, this is like with the least amount of impact on the environment. It's kind of a worthless conversation, but this education is important.
Right. And the objective is the objective is to make this work long term. And
Right.
And so, as much as we probably like to talk about maybe more philosophical momentum, it's
Right.
easy to attach larger social issues to an initiative. You've got to start with the economics, and you really do. And it's not a very popular topic to talk about it that way, but
Right.
it should be. Certainly, if you want things to last long term, and you're relying heavily on some sort of tax incentive, it just begs the question, what is, in fact, are your economics there to begin with? It doesn't necessarily conclude that they're not,
Right.
but it certainly can work to take away that economic conversation that you have to start with is what is how do you make this make money long term?
Right.
That is the problem. That's the growing pains with ESG.
Right.
Is finding out, I think you got a good product. I think you really do. It makes a lot of sense. It's great technology.
Right.
But before we get there, we really have to analyze the economic impact of the market that you're stepping into. Is the market ready? Is it viable enough? Is it timely?
When you're out there taking a look at these big projects, Johnathan, and you're one of the things I really like about interacting with you and having fun is you've got your in my case, since I went to Oklahoma State University, head to the ground or head to the pavement means I usually get a gravel in my forehead when I'm, I'm not as smart as those. But you're hearing things out there. Where do you think the oil and gas industry is going, or the energy area? What are you hearing from other CEOs? I mean, what do you think the biggest trend is right now?
Carbon capture is the biggest trend right now. That's decarbonization, I guess I should say, not necessarily carbon capture, but we represent and work with a lot of different types of energy clients. And whether it's a utility company that provides their product from natural gas or coal, whether it's an oil and gas company that drills in the Eagle Ford, operators in the Mid-Con, everybody seems to be talking about decarbonization. And so to call it a trend, a movement, I do believe maybe it's dissipating a little bit as some of the more economic issues come to the forefront, which is true of any emerging market. Happened in I'm not making an overstatement in comparing it to the U.S. space program, but when that got off the ground, it had a lot of lofty political and patriotic initiatives, and found out very quickly it was going to be really expensive, and a lot of problems started in the beginning. Ultimately, we were successful. Decarbonization is exactly the same. We're taking a lot of known technology that's never really been implemented in a market before to see what will work, what won't, what's possible and when.
Right.
So to answer your question, that's probably still the number one trend is
Okay.
uh, is decarbonization still. What I'm seeing though from oil and gas,
Right.
based on my own observations, are an increase in mid-size operators in the northern Eagle Ford. And that's
Nice.
only because we're doing a lot of work in carbon sequestration southeast San Antonio, South Texas, and
Right.
have encountered quite a bit of new drilling activity in that sort of Austin Chalk, northern Eagle Ford formation, which surprised me. If you follow the narrative on social media, I was under the
Right.
impression that oil and gas has been pretty much shut down
Right.
for various different types of reasons, but there seems to be a great deal of activity in that Southeast Texas region, only because that's where I'm currently working right now.
Well, you got to go where the money is, but
Yeah.
with the Freeport LNG area coming up, are you in the Haynesville that far over in the southeastern? No, the Eagle Ford's more in the middle. It's not nearly in the Haynesville.
No, further south, south
Yeah.
and east.
Yeah. The boy, with Freeport coming back online, do you have any takeaway that heads into that area? And I'm not sure. I can't remember which hub they're using, but Freeport has got a lot of BCF coming out of that thing to go to LNG.
Yeah. No, I really don't. Not specifically to Freeport. I will tell you, I'm a huge natural gas fan. I mean, I think the
Right.
potential is enormous, and it's so enormous that I really couldn't tell you where the limits might be. I never thought I would say that, 10 years ago, that we'd be talking about
Yeah.
such a focus and illumination on natural gas in the future of it. But I think where a lot of the issues that are born out of the renewable discussion
Right.
and a lot of the conversation that's born out of decarbonization, the reliability that's going to be necessary, the amount of storage of reliable energy that's going to be required. I think natural gas, certainly what we've seen going on in the EU with Russia and the Ukraine, I just think natural gas is probably poised to be the energy source of choice
Right.
in the next 10 to 20 years. And there's still tons of it. There's tons
Right.
of it in Texas. We know where it is.
Yeah.
It's easy to store. It's easy to transmit. We've got pipe, and it starts rolling the dominoes of my thought process
Right.
when you start talking about natural gas.
Johnathan, I think you're at the key core that is an intersection that I really had been hoping for but hadn't seen. And that's why I get so excited about our conversation.
Right.
The intersection between solar and oil is huge. The intersection between the fact that in COP26, I was the first one really to start coming, there was language buried in there that natural gas was going to be accepted because it has to be. It's
Right.
the least amount of, if you replace all of it and then, get rid of the coal plants and then go through what's happened over the last year with the energy crisis. Coal has gone through the roof and
Right.
everybody's burning coal again. It'd be a lot better if we were using natural gas. And Johnathan, the pipelines back east, they just put out this morning, I think it was either yesterday or this morning, I saw the article, and back east in New York City, the gas is hitting an all-time high again because of all the cold weather and everything else this morning. But for New York City in that area, they don't have pipelines from the Marcellus, and they're having to use LNG off of the international market coming in to the Boston Harbor in order to do that. They're not getting that low cost. We're at $2.50 something on US gas. They're having to bring it in at a lot higher cost. In Texas, we got pipelines. We got people that will say, we need us a pipeline. We need us this. And that to me makes your life a little easier with permitting on these projects, doesn't it? Or do you
Yes,
still
it
need
does.
permitting reform?
Absolutely. I don't know. When I hear permitting reform, again, there's two places that I go. One is electrical transmission, and the other one is going to be carbon capture sequestration. Again, that's just because those are the areas that I work.
Right.
And in those areas, yes, and I've believed that for a long time. We've done quite a bit of electrical transmission work in West Texas. It takes entirely too long. And if you're going to continue to develop renewables, which I think the state of Texas has long, committed itself that we have the potential and need to be pursuing that. What's holding back a great deal of it is we don't have adequate transmission. The transmission we have is highly saturated.
Right.
And the permitting process to build new lines is not, I think, is probably one of the more efficient in the country, but it takes entirely too long.
Right.
Certainly the permitting process that's going to be required for classic sequestration, underground storage of carbon dioxide in Texas as it exists right now.
Right.
Definitely. And I think a lot of that reform is actually going on right now, probably as we're speaking.
Nice.
On the floor of the legislature at the state level in Austin.
Nice.
As far as the federal permitting reformation that I think has been incorporated in some of that legislation, I don't really know enough about the national infrastructure need to know if permitting reform is needed or not.
Right.
Certainly what I've seen of my work, you always use a little bit more streamlining to get things done. And so if we're going to have, again, the momentum that followed Uri, where we're going to, I think, completely revamp our energy infrastructure using all these different safeguards and all these different energy sources and moving this power around, we're going to have to move a little bit faster than we have. And that's going to need a little bit of regulatory boost given the other component that we're dealing with in Texas that is relevant. And that is a population explosion that just won't stop. We're running power lines and pipelines through real estate that 10 years ago was littered with cattle, and now they're littered with subdivisions. It's really getting congested in the state of Texas. Whether that's good, whether that's bad, that's a matter of opinion. But in order to get transmission pipelines moving power around where we need it to be in the next 5 years, I do believe we're going to need some permitting, expedite the permitting process.
Right. I love your point. You're being a little more politically correct. I would like to say all of the people moving into the state, we love you. Come on in. Leave your voting practices behind. I can't be any more serious. Those voting practices have destroyed California.
I'm with you. No, that you don't have to be. Yeah, you're right. No, I completely agree with you.
And I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, if you're not.
No, I don't either.
If this is a right or wrong discussion, but just leave those ideology. Never mind. Okay, I can't even talk. I'm talking. Your cougar behind you is talking for better than I am. For our podcast listeners, you're going to see. I'm going to have a picture of a screenshot of Johnathan in there because, Johnathan, I got so tickled. Not only are you an industry thought leader, people were digging your Mountain Lyon behind you. In your office, you're sitting there. He's got a beautiful Mountain Lyon. It looks like he's just running down the road. Tell us the story again for that Mountain Lyon.
Absolutely, I will. And it's known. Cool. It's a faux pas, if you want to call it that. It's definitely a no-no in the hunting and taxidermy world, I think, to display an animal that you didn't take yourself. And I can't move my camera around, but my office has got several white-tailed deer, and it's got turkeys and rattlesnakes and things that I've shot over the year. Big outdoors for my family. A lot of really enjoy hunting in the outdoors of Texas, but this is the large exception. And anybody who's known me in the business over the last 18 years has seen this cougar. And in fact, anybody who's ever been to Nape, we used to exhibit down there. And we took this cougar with us for the very reason that I bought it from a collector director who had got it off of a rancher that was on the King Ranch, and it
Oh,
had been
yeah.
killed by lightning. And the side, profile picture, which you can't see, it's got a burn mark that goes from the front left to the rear right paw. It's a female. I displayed it in the front window of my business when I opened it up in West Texas. I didn't know anybody.
Right.
I didn't know any of the particular operators, didn't know anybody in the oil and gas industry. And so I thought the best way to get people to stop and introduce themselves was to stick a Mountain Lion in the window that had been killed by lightning. And then when we started traveling to trade shows, Nape was one in particular, we would take it with us and set it on a table in front of our booth, and people would stop and ask questions, much in the same way that you did here almost 20 years later. Right. And now it sits in this window right here. My kids have enjoyed playing with it over the years. And anyway, it's kind of become the Grammar Land and Exploration Corp, U.S. Carbon Capture, and several other businesses. It's become the mascot. So that's the story cool behind the mountain. Yeah. To your point previously, I have never taken a shot, but I have seen many, two in my life, and I've heard the calls in the middle of the night of the Mountain Lyon as well, and they penetrate the soul.
In fact, I was out last night. In full disclosure, I'm up here in what we call bear country because we had an overpopulation of bears, and over the last 25 years, we've seen the Mountain Lions 15, 20 times. And I had one scream. If anybody's ever heard, there's two things in life you really get a little nervous about, and that's the freight train of a tornado. Been two of them here, and then the scream of a mountain lion. So that scream of a mountain lion kind of got both of my hairs on the back of my head up last night when I heard.
Yeah, there's no mistaking when you hear what it is. For sure.
And it's kind of like it's worse than my ex-wife. So, Johnathan, what's next for you in U.S. carbon capture coming around the corner?
Well, I think Q1 of 23. I'm on a plane to Houston this week, as a matter of fact, to answer your question. A lot of the projects that we looked at right before and during the passage of the IRA, where people were still scratching their chins. A lot of internal policy still being formulated about how to implement carbon capture. We've known about the technology for a long time, but a lot of this just showed up. Even for your larger companies, still formulating their plans, looking at the economics. I think is now that 2023 budgets have now been approved for the month of January. And I think what we're seeing in our office is we're ready to open up the checkbooks and start a little bit more work than we did last year when we visited. Nice. So I think we're starting to see momentum thankfully dissipate from the IRA. It's kind of a frenzy where it was all over the press, it was all over the news. And now it's a little bit more of a practical and more digestible discussion about carbon capture. I cannot talk about it, though, without mentioning what I think is getting a little bit more attention. And I think what has slowed down a little bit of the momentum that started after the Reduction Act was passed is the same companies that were talking about decarbonization and ESG this time last year are now talking about layoffs and potential recession. Whether or not those things happen or not, we can't really talk about any market, whether it's real estate or movie production or auto sales, without talking about the rumblings of a potential recession in second quarter of 23 or maybe Q3. And whether or not that happens, you're starting to see it in Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Microsoft laid off 10,000. It's going to this year. What impact are we going to see from the elevated interest rates? Is it going to slow down the economy too much? So that obviously is influencing conversations in carbon capture and storage, but in just about everything else as well.
I'm sitting here, this whole marriage between the oil, solar, and everything else. really, you just nailed it, and I got it, my head kind of turning here for a second. I know we're just about out of time, but
Yeah.
1031 exchanges. I have tons of people asking about 1031 exchanges to get out of an exchange of a big property, oil and gas, a multi-family home, an apartment complex.
Yeah.
It would be so interesting to see about those 1031 exchanges into your royalties and looking at those royalty projects from a standpoint of helping out the housing bubble that I believe is coming around the corner and or the real estate, and then going into this perfect marriage of solar, royalties, and oil and gas. Holy smokes, that just I just had an epiphany here, if you would.
Yeah, it's an outstanding 1031s, you're the first person that's really brought that up in an interview. I think that would again, not one of your more exciting topics of conversation, but I think one of your more valuable mechanisms that exist is our 1031 exchanges. And I don't think a lot of people understand the relationship of that with oil and gas royalties. You talk about 1031 exchanges usually in sole real estate transactions.
Exactly.
But there is an interesting crossover, as you mentioned.
And I'm sitting there, I'm talking to several very extremely large investors. And this whole thing is just, Johnathan, really spurred a whole thing rolling in my head. So being able to visit with industry thought leaders is one of the biggest joys I have as a podcast host. So Johnathan, thank you for stopping by. And I've already got a few more things. I've got a ESG panel of how ESG interacts with oil and gas. And so your topics just really accelerated that to coming in a little bit sooner. So I'm going to extend the offer for you to be on that panel, because you bring some great thought leadership into this thing. So thank you. And one last thing, how do people get a hold of you?
You can go to either one of our websites, which is the U.S. Carbon Captures, us-ccs.com, and then Grammarland and Exploration is grammarland.com. So there's contact, submission forms, and all our information on the website.
Sounds great. Those will all be in the show notes. And Johnathan, I'll see you soon.
All right. Appreciate the conversation, Stu. Always good to talk to you.